Dun 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 dun. Hey everybody, it's True Powers Mine, and this is TPIM SR Live. Thank you all for joining me for part 2 of the U.S. Empire Explained. Now, the only reason why I'm bringing you guys this particular viewpoint or discussion point is you couple with the information I've shown you about the atheism, and you got the recipe for total delusion on a societal level of both spirit and I guess civic pride or whatnot as well. And this is not to validate either or, but just to give you all the tools to break the code. Now let's oh no. Hold on, here we go.
What of the United States that fills out that profile. 3 years later, when the United States expands overseas, it starts claiming uninhabited islands. And the reason it does so is really interesting. The reason it starts claiming islands is that it is seeking what is on those islands. It is seeking guano. In this case, the United States is having an agricultural crisis as it's transitioned to industrial agriculture. And one of the things that works really well to save these farms, and these farms are a huge part of the U.S. economy, is seabird droppings from islands, relatively rainless islands in the Caribbean or the Pacific, at the behest of U.S. farmers. The United States just seeks out as many of these islands, uninhabited islands, as it can find, ultimately claiming nearly 100 in the latter half of the 19th century.
Peace and power, Brother David. Welcome to the show.
And these become the first overseas holdings that the United States has. And it's really interesting because, up until then, the United States had always argued about, should we take, Louisiana Purchase, how much of Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. Here, there's just a single law. It's called the Guano Islands Act, and it says that any uninhabited islands that anyone sees that has guano on it can be annexed to the United States, and it will be considered as appertaining to the country. And there's just a sort of quick formal process, and boom, this island is suddenly part of the United States. And there's a Supreme Court case about this, so there's a question about the constitutionality, but the Supreme Court signs off on it, and ultimately this becomes the legal basis for a much larger and enduring U.S. overseas empire, because just that little phrase, these islands will be considered as appertaining to the United States, that just gives away the game, because suddenly the United States can expand overseas. And it is precisely on this legal precedent that the United States takes far larger colonies like the Philippines.
Then we get to World War II, Daniel, which is interesting because your book actually begins with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the event that was used to justify U.S. involvement in the war. Talk about what happened and its significance.
There are 3 dates in U.S. history that most people in the country know. So they know July 4th, 1776, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. They know September 11th, 2001. And they also know December 7th, 1841, the date which will live in infamy, when if you ask most people what happened on that day, they will say that's when Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was at that point in the territory of Hawaii. And that event has become such a constitutive part of national history, of national myth. There are movies made about it. But what those movies rarely show is what happens next, because Japan didn't just attack the territory of Hawaii. This was part of a intended to be simultaneous sort of all empire attack, where within a matter of hours, Japan attacked Hawaii, Wake Island, Guam, and the largest territory that the United States ever held, the Philippines. It also attacked the British territories of Hong Kong and Malaya, and the independent kingdom of Thailand. I mean, the whole point of this was that Japan was trying to sweep the leg of European and Anglophone empires in order to get room to expand within the Pacific. So, militarily, the damage done to the Philippines was arguably just as bad as the damage done to Pearl Harbor and Hawaii.
Now, once again, I know old boy probably won't allude to this, but there's been some serious conspiracy theories about the whole attack in Pearl Harbor pertaining to the aircraft carriers not being in dock when these planes came in and basically blew the hell out of everything. This type of, I guess, thought processes or slanting of the certain facts to kind of skew the image of the United States, which, if we really just based upon the reality, the things that's known, the things that aren't any type of secret documents. Now, of course, bring in the secret documents. I'm not saying not to, but I'm saying that if we look at the documents that are declassified, and we'll probably go to the I'll go to the CIA library, electronic library, and we can type in some topics, and we can see what's totally declassified, and that we can point out, well, you just can look at this and this and this and see that something's not right. There would not be one human being in the United States not one human being that would be upset or I guess disenfranchised with the nation if every citizen was treated preciously. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about no longer will you allow local municipalities to basically ticket people into oblivion. No longer will you allow obvious crooked law enforcement agents and officers to set up a mini cartel in disenfranchised communities. And what I mean by disenfranchised communities that have been traditionally targeted legally by the state. Let's continue.
And, people didn't know how to talk about this. They didn't know how to refer to what had just happened. We have a term for it, Pearl Harbor, but that term wasn't available at the time. It's not until a couple days later that you start hearing descriptions of the event as Pearl Harbor. So, if you see newspapers that are, composed within hours of this, they'll say things like Japan attacked Guam and Hawaii, or Japan attacked Hawaii and the Philippines. That's also exactly how FDR describes it in the first draft of his Date Which Will Live in Infamy speech. It's an attack on Hawaii and the Philippines. And then he changes his description of the main target. So this event is no longer narrated as an attack on these two large colonies, Hawaii and the Philippines. It's now an attack on the territory of Hawaii specifically. And now you have this question, why? Why did FDR change how he was narrating the target of the attack? He still mentioned the Philippines, but nevertheless, FDR clearly focused the attention of his audience on Hawaii. Even Hawaii was a little wobbly. It's a territory like the Philippines and Guam, but it has a larger white population. And that made it easier for people in the United States to imagine it as part of the United States. But Fortune magazine did a survey in 1940 asking its readers, would they support a defense of Hawaii? And its readers, barely a majority of them said yes. So you can see that FDR not only doesn't want to test his audience with the Philippines, but is even worried about Hawaii too. The last edit he makes to the speech, between the last paper draft that we have and the spoken version that he delivered, he makes a final edit and he inserts the word American before his description of the target. So that Japan didn't attack the island of Oahu, it attacked the American island of Oahu. And FDR, you can see him just sort of pushing that a little bit, just trying to round Hawaii up to American in the eyes of his audience so that he can deliver a clear story. The Empire of Japan attacked the United States of America, and it's time for war.
On this show, we often reference the U.S. dropping the nuclear bombs on Japan as kind of a really important moment for the U.S. empire to assert itself as the world power, kind of installing a new world order, as you can say. But at the same
Well, we should all realize that the United States has a long history of dropping bombs on people. And I don't have to go back to 1941 or 1945, rather, when they actually dropped the atomic bomb. You can go right back to 1985. Philadelphia, I believe. The push movement. Bomb dropped on the whole city block. 239 families or people actually injured. Untold number of families dislocated, because once they blow up your block, quite literally, you have no place to live.
Same time, your book explains that the US was kind of distancing itself from its colonial territories. The Philippines had gained independence, Alaska, Hawaii became states. Why shed power at the same time it had gained so much?
Yeah, so it's really interesting what the United States does, because up until largely World War II, the pattern had been when countries get more powerful, they get larger. They just seize more territory. That's what the British Empire had done. That's what its predecessors had done. And the United States, at the end of World War II, is kind of in an extraordinary position. It has atomic bombs. No one else has them. It has extraordinarily strong military. It has a system of bases that extend all over the planet. And it also has claims, either as colonies or more largely as occupied territories, quite a lot of people. So if you actually look at all of the lands that the United States has outside of the mainland, all of the places over which it exerts jurisdiction, all the places where the Stars and Stripe flies, you see that actually the United States controls more people outside of the states than in. There's a larger population beyond the mainland than there is in the mainland. There's a larger population outside of the states than in the states. And so that raises a really interesting question. Why didn't the United States double down? Why didn't it start going on an imperial shopping spree, doing what Britain would have done in the 19th century? And I think there are two answers to that question. One answer is anti-imperial resistance. Colonized people throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century have been gathering force, organizing, and after World War II, getting arms. They drove the cost of colonialism up. It was harder to take colonies, especially new colonies, after 1945 than it had been in, say, 1850. And there's another part of the story too. At the same time, the United States had gotten really good in World War II at what I call empire-killing technologies, ways of projecting force across borders, projecting influence across borders, rather than by trying to claim influence by extending borders, i.e., by taking new territory. And so those empire-killing technologies drove the demand for colonies down. And the combination of those two things, anti-imperial revolt and new technologies, making it easier for the United States to do what it wanted without claiming large colonies, that resulted in a new footprint of power, where the United States didn't seek large populated territories, but just sought instead dots, just military bases, hundreds of them, in fact, spread out all over the world, just these little small enclaves through which it could move its men, project its force and influence, and control much of the planet.
It's interesting that this kind of language was mainstreamed. I mean, we saw mainstream media publications, politicians, and scholars even kind of abandon those imperialist frameworks and kind of hid the empire in a sense, moving forward from that point.
Yeah, that's right. And one thing that's really interesting about the United States after 1945 as compared to right after 1900 is how little open talk there is about the colonies that the United States still has. The Philippines becomes independent pretty quickly after that, but Hawaii and Alaska, it's not until 1959 that they become states. And the United States still has, as territories, Guam, it still has Puerto Rico, it still has the US Virgin Islands, it still has American Samoa, and now has the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. But it's really hard to find a lot of forthright discussion of these places on the mainland, and far less so than in 1900, when the overseas parts of the United States were places to be openly celebrated.
Now, I want you to understand, Yao, the opinions that is being expressed isn't really coming from a side of love. I mean, you can almost, I'm just going on the line here, but you can almost hear the venom in their voice. I mean, as far as the hatred of the United States. So for those who hate the United States, you're not alone. There's people all over the planet. This is what I'm really trying to illustrate. Because I'll be quite honest. When I first saw this video, I was shocked. I was truly shocked. And the first thing my mind said, this is some very basically anti-United States material. And they're being very anti-United States in a very negative way. I mean, trying to depict, or actually depicting, the United States as a colonizing force, which it is. I'm not denying that. But that goes back to the question, then why do most of the citizens not view us, the nation, as a colonizing nation? And that goes to a deeper question. Let's continue with this.
U.S. rule over these territories today may be hidden to us on the mainland, but it's not hidden to the peoples living there, Daniel. They live under U.S. rule every day. What rights and political power do the people living in these territories have?
Yeah, so that's a really important point to make. It's true from the perspective of the mainlands that a lot of people have a hard time keeping an eye on the overseas parts of the United States, but the reverse is absolutely not true. There is no way that you can grow up in Guam and be confused about whether Guam is part of the United States. You see the stars and stripes flying, that's the flag of the country. The president of the United States is the president of your country because you are part of the United States. The bills, the money, all of that, attests to U.S. sovereignty. And yet, despite the fact that these places are unambiguously part of the United States, I mean, look, U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, it's in the actual names. Nevertheless, despite this, it can be, the people who live in such places have a restricted set of rights. So they don't have rights to meaningful representation in Congress. They can, in cases, vote for delegates who will be physically present in the Capitol, but those delegates don't have effective voting rights. And that matters a lot. And it's not entirely surprised that federal funding for territories is consistently lower than what it is for states. In fact, when there's a federal law passed, it doesn't automatically extend to the territories. Usually there's a kind of separate settlement. And often if that settlement involves funding, it'll be lesser. And, it's not entirely a shock once you think about that, that every territory is economically has an average income that is below every state in the union. Congress and Congress alone gets to decide who becomes a state. And Congress has, been fairly uninterested over the last 100 years of admitting places like the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico to statehood. But why has Congress been uninterested? Well, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that folks from the territories are disenfranchised or subordinated by every branch of government. So it's not just that if you're not a state, for example, if you're Puerto Rico, you don't have delegates in Congress.
See, I wish they would have been as honest as they was in the beginning with that question. The reason why, brothers and sisters in Puerto Rico and Guam, you're not going to become a state because you do not have a high enough, I guess, European American population. Apparently, Hawaii did.
Congress who can effectively vote in Congress. It also means that if you're in Puerto Rico, you can't vote for the U.S. president as long as you're in Puerto Rico. And also, according to the Supreme Court, the Constitution also doesn't fully extend to the overseas territories of the United States. So it's actually fairly hard for people who are living in the inhabited territories to get a full voice and to get the kind of political momentum I think that would be required to change the shape of the United States. So yeah, you're right. There is not a lot that people in the territories, at least on paper, are able to do. And that's possibly one reason why there has been, in the history of U.S. empire, a history of, among other things, armed insurrection. So U.S. Annexation of the Philippines was quickly followed by a large and bloody war, a war that we think killed more than 750,000 people, many of them dying from disease, almost all of those people who died Filipino, a war that extended from 1899 to petering out by 1913. It was the second longest war that the United States ever fought. That was a really serious war, and Filipinos couldn't just vote and decide they wanted independence. If they wanted independence, the only way they really had to get it was to fight for it. In 1950, Puerto Rican nationalists staged a 7-city revolt on the island. They took government buildings. In one city, it had to be suppressed by air power as planes flew overhead and strafed a U.S. city. So there have been moments of violent resistance, and that has a lot to do with the fact that there's really no official on-paper mechanism by which colonial subjects can determine their own status.
Speaking of colonial subjects, Daniel, of course, with the seizure of land comes this forced homogenization.
Art creation. Welcome to the show, by the way, Peace and Power. The real picture is that the government of the United States, North America, whatever you want to call it, does not give a damn about the rights of Black African Americans. And we can just put a comma after that and say brown Americans, put a comma after that, yellow Americans, put another comma after that. Even, I guess, the so-called red-skinned Americans or Aboriginal Americans, but that term is so not quite genuine. Just as this report here from these people are showing a different side to the United States, there's also a different side to the history of the true Aboriginal peoples of the Americas, the continent, North, Latin, or Central, and then South America. And we did not come through a land bridge of ice. And there were people who are brown, copper tone people waving at Christian. Come on, boy, get off the ship. Come on, eat some of the food over here. Here, take a chick. I mean, they were so kind and so giving. And all these people were like, oh shit, we just rolled up into heaven. Now let's turn into hell. All right, let's roll on.
What practices and effects of forced homogenization were employed by the U.S. homeland on its colonial subjects?
If you think about what empires do, a lot of their day-to-day activity involves coordinating, involves taking a foreign patch of land and making it compliant in some way with the norms and practices of the motherland. So that might look like laying down railway tracks of, just the right gauge, or it may look like educating students in schools and educating them to speak, in the case of the U.S. empire, English. And the U.S. did a lot of that in its colonies. It tried to, first of all, to get its colonial subjects to fully understand that they were now part of the United States, that they had to venerate the flag, that the money that they carried would have George Washington or similar people on the bills. But the United States also pushed English as a language of instruction throughout its empire, trying to get people who had spoken Spanish or Tagalog or Chamorro to speak English. And it had varying amounts of success in that. But part of the point of empire is to take foreign places and to make them more domestic, right? To make them sort of work from the perspective of the motherland. And of course, that's what the United States did throughout its colonial empire too.
The U.S. empire is big in terms of its formal territories, gets a lot larger, of course, when you're talking about the 800 plus military bases around the world. It gets even larger, though, when you're looking at the financial and cultural control.
Yeah.
The U.S. dollar, the English language. This was a part of your book that I had never really thought of before, and I found it really important. I was wondering if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, so one thing is really important to recognize is that even though the physical size of the United States' territorial empire shrinks after 1945, that's partly first of all, there's still territories, there's still inhabited territories, there are hundreds of military bases, but part of the reason the United States can make do with that kind of empire, what I call a pointillist empire rather than a large colonial empire, is that it gets really good at projecting its influence across borders.
Daniel, is there any comparison in the world today to the United States? Is its scale matched by any world power in history?
So right now, the United States is the dominant power on the planet. And you can see that in a lot of ways. You can see that through the predominance of the US dollar, the spread of the English language. But you can also see that, and this is really important to recognize, in the territorial spread of the United States. And, I said that the United States has hundreds of foreign military bases. Just for perspective, every other country combined, if you take all the foreign bases that are owned by every other country combined, you get a number around 30. Hundreds, like we think 800 compared to 30. That gives you a sense of the outsized presence militarily, which is matched by an outsized presence culturally, linguistically, financially of the United States in the world today.
Seems like a lot of Americans are aware of outposts that the U.S. maintains around the world, but they still are kind of convinced that just the basis of U.S. imperialism, I guess, is benign, that the U.S. empire is a benign force acting in goodwill to stabilize the planet, to act as the world's policeman. Why do you think this is? Why is there such a large disconnect, not only in academia, but just in the general populace about what the U.S. is doing in our names?
Yeah, so I think that there's a real argument today, right, about the nature of U.S. foreign relations. Is the United States the last bastion of liberty, or is it a world-dominating force? And we're seeing this argument play out in the headlines. We're seeing it play out in very public ways. What I think people don't get, and what I think distorts that argument, is that usually that's an argument about character, and it's assumed that, largely assumed that the United States is like other countries, is just constrained within its borders, and then it has certain policies, good or bad, and other countries have policies, good or bad. But that's not quite true. The United States actually embraces the entire planet. It has military bases, virtually in everyone's backyard. If it's not in a single country, it might be in the country next door, and there might be a number of bases in the country next door. And that gives the United States just this unusual position that I think is hard for a lot of people to get fully in view, but it certainly makes the United States a uniquely powerful and privileged country. And I think without really understanding that, it's actually quite hard to understand U.S. foreign relations or even U.S. history.
Right. I call us empire babies with this kind of extreme historical ignorance and lack of understanding about, the nature of U.S. empire and imperialism. But it seems like almost British people are at least aware that they live in an empire and that Britain has done some horrible things, that Americans still seem a little bit blissfully unaware.
And they say it like it's a bad thing. They say it like it's a bad thing. This is why I talk about the Republic, guys. If it's not us, it will be someone else. You better bet your bottom dollar. The genie's out. So you can try to run as fast as you can. But you're not escaping this. Why do you think white supremacy is everywhere? We got to battle this thing here in America to liberate the world. If freedom was truly given, and we had a policy that you stay in your country, but you adopt our government, you pay into our economical system, and we will come and send the 101st Airborne down there and free you, you wouldn't be able to stop people from sending in applications and treat you right. You don't have to worry about your daughters being raped. You don't have to worry about your fathers being shot. You don't have to worry about your mothers crying and asking for prayers. Because it's about true liberation. It's about true freedom. We can't run from this, guys. We can't. Let's continue this up.
Aware of what's going on here.
So there's a really good example of this, and that is after September 11th, after Osama bin Laden had masterminded this set of attacks on the United States, on the U.S. mainland. In fact, the common question was, why do they hate us? Right? What is it about our character that they don't like? What are they not getting about us? And there was this sort of shirt rending and confusion in the United States about how could this have happened. But look, Osama bin Laden had been perfectly clear about his objections. He had a lot of them, and the list could be extensive. But there was one thing that Osama bin Laden kept coming back to. It had been sort of, why he started his jihad against the United States, and it had constantly been a core issue, which is a U.S. base in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, the Holy Land containing Mecca and Medina, that had been a major issue, not just for Osama bin Laden, but for a number of Saudis. It turns out that stationing a base in someone else's country can be a really uncomfortable thing. In fact, that's part of why the United States had a war against Britain for its own independence, was that the British had been stationing and quartering troops in uncomfortable ways in the North American colonies. So it's not entirely a surprise that other people all around the world, and I talk about this in various parts of my book, would react with protest to U.S. bases. But nevertheless, the inability of a lot of people in the United States to recognize that there is a very real territorial and colonial history that connected the United States, this man so seemingly far off, from Saudi Arabia at that point in Afghanistan that would explain this, besides like just Osama bin Laden's decision that he doesn't like the personality of the United States. The inability of a lot of people in the United States to recognize that history, I think that's a classic example of the way in which, territorial empire, the actual space of empire, gets obscured and then makes everything a lot more confusing.
Confusing. Such an appropriate word. Brothers and sisters, you're confused by design. They keep history like this for a reason away from you. They'll never teach you true Latin in school. They'll never teach you about the law. We talked about this on the show several times. The only reason why I've been going so hard, once again, for the uninitiated, the new viewer, but for some of us older veterans of the show, so we can reanalyze some things and see where this is going. Once again, I sincerely want to thank the confidential informant that sent me this clip. And thank you all, everyone knows that Sister Kathy and Brother Al, shares things with me. And if you don't know, well, now you know. But there's a whole host of other folks. And that's only because when we were doing the moderation program, it was cool. But now it's totally open because time's running out. All comments are welcome. Now, if you're obvious troll, we'll deal with you, whatnot. But the thing is, y'all, for those who want to see America be destroyed, I just provided you with all the current information of how they're going to do it. They're destroying the religious fabric of the nation, and now they're destroying the image of the nation. Just like a people, you destroy the image and the spirit, then you can destroy it. Everyone, just buckle up, because it's going to be one hell of a ride. Patriots, you might want to start taking pictures and keep them dear to the heart, because the political landscape, as they say down south, is fitting to change. This concludes TPIM, the U.S. Empire Explained, Part 2. Thank you all. Thank you. I just wanted to complete this little series. Hopefully next time you hear me, I'll have Dr. Randy Short on the line. If it won't be tonight, it'll definitely be in the early morning tomorrow. But until then, live your life with integrity, without hate, envy, or greed. As always, brothers and sisters, please, 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 let's try to be kinder to one another. Peace in our power, unity in our victory, dignity in our respect. Liberation. I'm out.